Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about coaching. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, what are some instances where you, as a tech lead, have coached other software engineers? So usually coaching is down to sort of figuring out what at least, I don't want to make it sound like I'm some type of like I know everything and there's nothing that, I still have things that I'm learning, guys. uh, it really comes down to, can you convey that to the people who are usually like your managers and so forth, that you have the necessary skill set and social skills, and including social skills and technical skills, and the experiences necessary in order to take on a role where you basically responsible for the success of the team and then mentor other people into being, sort of better than what they are, like being able to do all the things that they need to do, right? And that coaching thing, uh, it comes usually. You can do that when you're a junior. You can, if you are a decent junior, let's say that you're really good at CSS, or you're really good at Java, or you're good at something, right? If you see somebody else who's struggling a little bit, you can do the same thing. It really is that if you're gonna have it as a job, if when you get to my level of experience, or like my level within the company that I'm working with, uh, it's just that you just take a bigger responsibility. Like it becomes more of what you do. And so instances when that happens, it comes down to, what am I like? Who am I dealing with? Am I dealing with an entire team? Like, do they have a problem with something that is like at the team level? Do they have do somebody is somebody struggling at an individual level, etc., etc.? So it really comes down to figuring out, like, based on my experiences, what do they need help with. So examples of that would be, let's take an example at an individual level. So usually when I deal with junior level developers, it really comes down to, well, it doesn't have to be juniors, it can be mid-levels, and in some cases it's senior level developers as well, where I see that something that they are doing, or something that is happening, like maybe they have issues with bugs, they have issues with configurations, they have issues with something that I know something about. Well, then it's really easy. You just come and like sort of help out, and you try to explain how things work, or you try to discuss on how to do things. So an example would be for a junior level developer. The other day I was working with that person, and they've never worked. In this case, this was a TypeScript project. They've never worked with Yarn workspaces before, ever, and they've never been part of a monorepo in the situations that which was what we were running, right? And so they couldn't figure out how the focus command was working. It worked basically when you're just installing a specific workspace for Yarn workspaces, and because it was working locally, but it was not working when they were running it in the pipeline. And I explained to them, it's very simple, because you are copying only your module, or like your workspace, but in order for you to get the other workspaces installed as well, you're going to have to make sure that that code is included as well. And so we walked through how the Docker image build actually works, and like this idea of having a dedicated image, or like it's basically, I'm not going to go simplify it too much, but it's basically a separate file system. It's a record of what the file system looks like within the image, and so that when the container starts up, it attaches that file system for you. And so we talked about that, and then we had a little bit of a learning session on like basically virtualization or containerization, and how it sort of in theory works at the very least. And so after that they understood that, alright, if I want my files to be included, I need to make sure that I actually copy them in, or add them. Well, usually you copy them at least. So that's an instance of how something like that can be done. And then there are more advanced instances, for example, where we have things like really senior software level, like really senior software developers who have issues with working within the environment. So like I had this was a front-end developer. This person had, well, was a senior, but they never ever worked with, in this case we were working with Argo CD and a Kubernetes cluster. And their task was to change the base URL of the application, because basically we were trying to set up a path-based routing system for a new domain, so that when you hit the domain, you're basically routed to individual, the router will route based on whatever the path is, and in order for that to work, they basically need to change the base URL of their application. And this person had never, they were struggling really with understanding Ingress. In this case, we were doing it with the Ingress. Don't tell me about that, but because I wasn't happy about that. But the concepts of Argo and the concepts of Kubernetes, and like how to actually change the base URL and what that actually meant, and why things weren't routing correctly, and figuring out why, another one, this other person had done the similar sort of thing where they had used an absolute URL instead of a relative path when they were dealing with the routing, and basically I told them that that's not going to work. And then we had to walk through, okay, how does DNS actually work? How does DNS differ internally to Kubernetes as opposed to going to the public internet, and so forth. And so we walked through sort of how that works. And so these are the sorts of situations you might want to do at the team level, at an individual level. You look at specific problems, and if you can help out, you try to help out. In a team setting, it's usually the case that you have to understand, to a great deal at the very least, what makes a team successful, what practices do they need to follow, and then you set those practices up. It can be anything from how do you make sure that all the things that are necessary to understand within the team setting is documented. How do you know that the developers will not just say fuck it to all the things they don't have to do if you're not using the whip? How do you make sure that they do it voluntarily, or that they actually maintain updating their test coverage, updating the documentation, making sure that they have someone who answers if there are requests towards the team, etc., etc. How do they actually do these sorts of things, right? And usually in that scenario, I set up a structure. I usually do the same thing. I basically go in and I have a talk with everybody, and then I just write down everything that we're going to work towards. The reason why I documented this, I've mentioned that in another video, because basically if something is written down, it feels official. And if it feels official and everybody agrees with it, you can use that to change people's behavior. If you just wish willy-nilly saying that, yeah, you should do that or you should do that, then it's your word against theirs. But if it's written down, they don't have much in terms, then they apply. They basically are going to be, I'm not saying brainwashed, but they're going to be coerced into following those practices, because if they say that no, I didn't know about it, that's bullshit because it was written down. If they say that I didn't remember, then I just refer them to, yeah, it should. It becomes embarrassing. If it's just something you say, it has less impact on future discussions or arguments that you might have about the topics than if you just have it written down. That's why, for example, as I like to say, the law is a genius idea, because just by writing it down and making it official, quote unquote, it becomes very difficult for you to deny that, yeah, wow, this is not really what it is, etc., etc. It becomes easier for you to discuss it, right? So you usually start with that, and then you start mentoring people into reminding them to follow these practices and so forth. And then you have to, of course, have decent practices, right? And so an example of when I've been doing that is to basically whenever I set up a new team. The teams, practically every team I've ever started up and ran for any length of time have adopted my practices, and even when I left the team, they're still using them because usually they work, or this system works pretty well. And then you have other things where you might see that they have problems with releasing into production, where they have a lot of I've worked with a team where they have a lot of integrations, for example. And in that scenario, they're basically pushing things into production because it's only in the production environment they can really test things out. And then they sort of push that and hope, cross their fingers and hope that it works. And in that scenario, you have to teach them how to do testing in production without impacting the user experience. And that leads us to feature flagging, for example. How do you do feature flagging correctly so that you can run two pieces of functionality in parallel, test them in your browser or in your whatever like test it out before exposing it to the user, and when it works, you shift it over basically. Those are sort of more advanced concepts, and then I've done coaching on like how do you do visual regression testing efficiently, how do you keep your coverage, like your unit test coverage up, how do you write effective REST clients, or how do you maintain a client library for a lot of REST clients, etc., etc. How do you do end-to-end testing? How do you do a blue-green deployment effectively, etc., etc. So like there's tons of the stuff that you can do at the team level, and then of course things like even simple things like how do you make sure that people do code reviews in a timely manner, because the number one problem usually in every single team, it never changes, is that the code review takes the longest because nobody does it after, they do it after a few days, and how do you make sure that that behavior changes? These are examples of things like problems that I've usually have faced with teams, and the video is long enough, I can't go through all of that sort of stuff, but these are the sort of things that I usually have helped out with if I'm not doing my own coding or inventing something or making something that is solving a very specific problem. I've been working on things that are like more code related of course as well, but these are the coaching things that usually happen. So what I want you to take away from this is that usually when I coach, or like the way that you usually coach people, software engineers, is either at an individual level, and you usually comes down to, well, it's the same for both really. You take a look at what this individual has been struggling with, or if there's something that you can make a teachable moment, and then you try to walk them through sort of how it works and why you do a thing in a certain way and sort of the reasoning behind it. I usually don't take the approach that one way is better, or like that my way is the right way. I usually just present what I think is true, and then if they think it makes sense, it makes sense. If it doesn't, it doesn't make sense. It really comes down to if, like, is this an important thing to follow, an important practice, or something that's going to make them go forward, or is there something that you can sort of leave up to people? Like I'm not the guy who's going to breathe down your neck if you're not naming files better or naming variables or small shit like that. It's not irrelevant to me as long as it's understandable. But I might have an opinion if you decide to just willy-nilly introduce a lot of advanced concepts within the code base when there's a practice already established, because that forks the practices in a way that makes it very difficult for less experienced developers to deal with the code. But usually things like that, lower things like that, is what I help out with at the individual level. And at the team level, it's usually around how do you run an efficient team? How do you optimize your process from desktop all the way into production and running things in production? Because my experience is usually, well, it's full stack, let's call it full stack plus. Like basically I've been running teams and we're doing full stack development for a few years now, so usually I have some experiences that can be relevant from all the way from, like, if you're doing front and back end, doesn't really matter, all the way up to like your entire testing process, your release process, and your hosting solutions, and how you set up all the things related to the cloud. So these are the things I usually focus on, because every team has like strengths and weaknesses. Usually it's rare that you have like a team that knows all of that at the same time, and that's usually what you focus on, the stuff that you know needs to be there in order for the work process to work effectively. Have a great day.